Hello, everyone, and welcome to another segment of the Portuguese-American Hour here on KGST Multicultural 1600 AM. We are live and in session, and it's actually a Zoom session, so we will be also sharing this on Facebook with our friends at later dates. Hopefully, you'll join us. So if you don't hear us live on the KGST Multicultural 1600 AM, the Portuguese-American Hour, we will be on Facebook as well with this. We do this once in a while just to provoke your interest and hopefully have you follow us every single week. Our guest is Dr. Monique Kelley-Vallance, PhD in Portuguese history from the University of California in Santa Barbara. Welcome, Monique. We're glad to have you back.
Thank you.
And what are we going to learn, as always, in Portuguese history from the most exciting Portuguese historian in the, I was going to say in the United States, but I think it's in the universe, whole wide universe, all the other planets as well. I don't think we can find anyone that's as interested, not so much interested. I'm sure lots of people are interested, but interesting in telling the Portuguese history. So welcome and thank you.
I appreciate that. So today I wanted to talk about the town of Olivença, which I find to be a really interesting case. So, you know, in a continent like Europe that's had civilization for over 2,000 years, you're obviously going to have border disputes, and there have been plenty of them. Probably the most famous, the dispute over Alsace-Lorraine between, Germany and France. I mean, I think they've gone back and forth so many times, they don't even know if they're German or French or what are they. And what's interesting is that Portugal and Spain also have a border dispute over the town of Olivença that lasts to the present day. And it's one of the last border disputes in Europe. But in typical Portuguese fashion, it's being handled passive aggressively. So I don't know if anything's ever going to come of it. But so the town of Olivença sits on the Guadiana River, which is obviously on the eastern border of Portugal. And it became a Portuguese town in 1297 when it was ceded to Portugal by Don Sancho IV of Castile. And then the next year, Don Denis in 1298 gave it its own charter. Now, in the medieval period, when the town had its own charter, that meant that it was not owned by an overlord. Typically, towns were either owned by, like, say, a duke, an earl, the church, a monastery. Usually you had an overlord of that nature. But if you had a charter, you were a free city, and that meant that you would have your own aldermen. They would have their own governance, and they would only answer to the king, and they didn't have to answer to like the local duke or anything like that. So Olivença has a pretty long history of being on its own and being independent and being a Portuguese city. Now, of course, we had that little period we don't like to talk about, like Bruno, between 1580 and 1640, where, Spain actually ruled Portugal. And during that time, after Portugal received its independence back, there were some Spanish loyalists who did try to return Olivença or keep Olivença a Spanish city, but eventually was returned back to Portugal. So everything seems hunky-dory. And as we've seen in our many, many podcasts that we've done up until now, we know that Spain and Portugal have been frenemies. They kind of have an uneasy quote unquote friendship, kind of like what mean girls do, right? It's like you're nice to each other's faces, but I'll stab you in the back the first chance I get. And that's what Portugal does. And that's why I say it's like typical Portuguese passive aggressiveness. So Portugal doesn't want. So we had like the War of Spanish Succession in the early 1700s when the Spanish actually tried to leave the crown of Spain to the grandson of Louis XIV. So automatically England and Austria were against that, and Portugal joined right along with England. And then you see in 1801, this happened again. So Napoleon was not the emperor yet, but he was already in charge of, he's the consul of France. And his big thing was to try to bring down Britain, and Britain was his biggest enemy. And he couldn't attack Britain like he could the other countries because, of course, there's an ocean in between, and his navy was not where the army was. So his way of bringing down England was to do a blockade and have nobody trade with England. That way he could defeat them that way, which is a very smart idea. And he was able to get everybody to follow along with that plan except Portugal. And so Portugal, was, John João, who was eventually João VI, the first. Maria was not capable of ruling at this time, so João had already taken over as Prince Regent. He was also passive aggressive. He didn't want to say no to Napoleon, which is a smart move because Napoleon would attack, right? But he also didn't want to stop trade with Britain because our trade with Britain was so very important, and we'd already been friends with Britain for so long. So in 1801, they tried to get a treaty together, and it was the Treaty of Badajoz, where Spain and France and Portugal were supposed to sign a treaty where Spain and Portugal would agree to not trade with England, and Portugal backed out of that. And so then Napoleon's troops invaded and took Olivenza and gave it to Spain. So that didn't work. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that by 1807, Spain and France had actually they had drawn up a secret treaty, the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which the intent was to invade Portugal, take it over, split Portugal and the Portuguese possessions between the two of them. But it never came to light because in the meantime, Napoleon invaded Spain, arrested the king, and put his brother Joseph as the king of Spain. And then Joseph took off with all the Spanish crown jewels and went to the Americas the next year. So I say bem feito.
Yes, that's a very good Portuguese word, bem feito.
It's my favorite one. My kids hear it all the time. They get so mad at me. But
for those who don't understand any Portuguese, it kind of means serves you right, kind of that idea.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not. It doesn't mean well done. It can also mean well done, but we use it has a double meaning in Portuguese. It's pretty much serves you right for doing.
It's not a good thing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Right. If you hear someone tell you bem feito, it's not the same thing as a good job. No.
No. So luckily the Treaty of Fontainebleau didn't come into fruition, and we fast forward to the Congress of Vienna, and Napoleon is defeated. In 1814, the Treaty of Paris was signed between France and Portugal to give Olivenza back to Portugal, but Spain was not a part of that treaty and did not sign off on it, so it does not count according to international law. When the Congress of Vienna met in 1815, and this is the group of European countries who are deciding, okay, what are we going to do with Europe now that Napoleon is out of the picture? There was actually a clause in the Treaty of Vienna where Olivenza was supposed to go back to Portugal, but the Spanish delegation refused to sign it. And so by the time the treaty actually came out, the ones that Spanish did sign, it didn't say that Spain had to give back Olivenza to Portugal. So after that is where we see more of an aggressive Hispanicization of Olivenza, where the Spanish authorities are actually outlawing the Portuguese language in schools, at church. There was a few Portuguese homeschooling or private schools left. Those were all closed down. And in the meantime, Portugal never has, even to this day, has not let go of its claim over Olivenza. So Spain officially changed its name to Olivenza. Isabella II gave it a charter, made it a city of Spain. But what's really interesting is even since then, I mean, if you see the few times that the subject, they even come near the subject, it's like not discussed. So if you look at Portuguese military maps, or when they had signed treaties between Spain and Portugal over where to put the borders, they have definitively said the border. They talk about up in Minho all the way down, but then when you talk about the area of Olivenza, it's not discussed. It's kind of like we're going to pretend like this isn't even a thing. And so it's really interesting. Spain won't even discuss it, but Portugal continues to say any chance that they have, they're like, well, Olivenza is still ours. So there was the situation where there was two bridges that were being built in that area. And the original agreement was that Portugal and Spain were going to work on the bridges together. And then Portugal decided, wait a minute, if we allow Spain to help us, this is admitting that Olivenza belongs to Spain. We don't want that. So they told Spain, no, we're going to do it all ourselves in that area. Well, then Spain went and did it anyway. And then Portugal got mad and they protested, but what can you do? So it's just kind of this situation where, Portugal is just kind of like, hey guys, we still think that city is ours. And Spain is like, I don't hear you. I don't know what you're talking about. So now what's interesting too, is that there are about 800 citizens that we know of that actually consider themselves to be Portuguese, because they did apply for Portuguese citizenship and were granted Portuguese citizenship. So they are Portuguese citizens living in technically a Spanish town. But we don't know how much it's a town of like maybe 11 or 12,000 people. So we don't know the percentage of people. Nobody's ever asked them, to be honest. And this is kind of the weird thing. Nobody's ever asked them what they want. Like, do you consider yourself Portuguese or do you consider yourself Spanish? And we know that Spain has a history. If you look at just Barcelona or Catalonia in general, not everybody in the Spanish country wants to be a part of Spain, and a lot of people resent the Castilians, especially. So
sure, the Basque,
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that nobody's ever asked them what they want. Maybe, and I'm wondering if Spain is afraid to ask, or they really just don't care.
Well, I think that probably you're probably a combination of both, if I had to guess. But I think the first one, because there is a thought that in Portugal, as we've spoken before, Portugal has kind of a role here that's interesting, which is when it comes to Barcelona and Catalonia, which is Portugal is all for freedom, but isn't in favor of the Catalonians basically choosing their path.
Right.
And basically some Portuguese political scientists and historians, as yourself, believe that it kind of is a mixed bag, because Portugal, that may happen with the Azores or Madeira. You never know.
Right.
It's not likely today, but who knows what's going to happen 100 years from now.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and it's sad because we owe Catalonia. If it wasn't for them, we may, I don't know when we would have gotten our independence from Spain, because the Catalonians revolted in 1640, and the Spanish were so busy dealing with them, they didn't notice we revolted. And by the time it was already over, they're like, wait, what happened? And Portugal was already independent.
Yeah. Well, and there's so much closeness between, and even the language, I think there's so much similar.
Catalonian language is very different.
Yeah. And there's, but it's interesting that, buenos dias in Spanish, bon dia in Portuguese, and they say bon dia with an N. Mm-hmm. And so there's some similarities to the Portuguese in spelling, especially, that are much similar, interesting, than Castilian Spanish is. Right. So it's an ongoing. So you don't see in the near future, and historians are not good at predicting the future, as they shouldn't be, but you don't see in the future, whether the future means, as a historian, this better than all of us, which is you don't look at things in 10-year periods. You look at things in sometimes in hundreds or 200-year periods. You don't see that there is an Iberian unity any time, because some people in Portugal and in Spain believe that we will eventually may have an Iberian unity, but who knows?
No, I think the chances of that are as likely as some of our fraternal societies. You saw what happened. We had 4 fraternal societies get together, and then we were all Portuguese. So I really think there's so much history there of the two always kind of bumping heads. I think I think Spain would be okay with it. I think they would only be okay with it. Whoever one would be okay with it if they got to take over the other one.
Sure.
But if they had to do a merger, I don't see that working at all. Right. It would make sense because of the geography, obviously, but I think there's just too much history there. It's kind of like, when you look at the Balkans, and when the communists tried to force Yugoslavia to be all together, the only reason it worked as long as it did was because they hated the Soviets more than they hated each other. Correct. And then as soon as the Soviet Union was gone, they're like, oh yeah, I hate you. I forgot.
Yeah.
I forgot
we don't like each other very much. Yeah.
And it's the same country.
And
I
think
Republic.
And I think, what do you think? I think that with the European Union, the European concept of states, it may allow in the future for smaller states. In other words, instead of a Spain, there may be a Spain and a Catalonia and a Basque country. And, some of the islands may be, in regions. So the concept of European Union, if it continues to be successful, and who knows, it might abdicate for that need of an Iberian unity or whatever. Because if there's a European Union, it doesn't make any difference if your country has, to a certain degree, 1 million people, or it has 65 million people. You're all Europeans. Is that a concept that may keep the countries, from unifying within each other? Maybe.
I think definitely, because it takes away that desperate urgency that Portugal and Spain might have had, if a pre-European Union. I mean, if
Right.
they hadn't have formed the European Union, and Portugal and Spain hadn't gotten the support from the European Union that they've had, I think that maybe it would have become a financial necessity. But I think even then, like, maybe I'm just too nationalistic, but I think it would have been like they'd have to be like desperate, like,
Sure.
we literally have no other
Sure.
choice.
Sure.
But
The only time they liked each other was when we both had dictators, Salazar and Franco.
even then, I think the dictators like
Even then, they weren't the best of friends, but they did meet a couple of times, I understand. Well, Monique, thank you so much. We appreciate it. That's Dr. Monique Kelley-Vallance, PhD in Portuguese history from the University of California in Santa Barbara, and our historian here for the Portuguese-American Hour, PBBI, the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University, Fresno. Thank you all for joining us.